All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something really complex, honestly pretty chilling, and just a total labyrinth of a case. We're gonna objectively break down the anatomy of the 2008 disappearance of a 41-year-old guy named Jack Barry in Cortez, Colorado. And it starts out looking like your standard missing person report. Yeah, it very quickly spirals into this incredibly dark maze of family trauma, bizarre accusations, and some truly gruesome discoveries.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're gonna map it out chronologically. We'll start with his mysterious vanishing, uncover the family's dark history, contrast their testimony with actual physical evidence, map out the forensic discoveries, and then finally, look at the progression to sentencing.
Section 1. A mysterious disappearance. To really wrap our heads around how case gets this complicated, we've got to look at the timeline first. And right off the bat, there is a glaring gap. Jack was last seen by his family in late February of 2008, living out of a trailer in an area they called the Orchard. But his brother Jim didn't file an official missing person report until April 28th. That is 2 full months later. Now, Jack was pretty transient. He was kind of known for just packing up and disappearing to trap or hunt for months on end, so his absence didn't immediately set off alarm bells. But as soon as detectives started asking questions, yeah, the red flags went up instantly. So almost immediately, investigators are hit with completely conflicting stories from Jack's own family. You've got his mother, Sandra, admitting that Jack took frequent, totally unexplained trips. But then you talk to Jack's 20-year-old son, Jeremiah, and he gives detectives this highly specific, totally contradictory story. He claims his dad drove off to Utah in a blue Dodge Ram with some tall, unknown woman. Naturally, these massive inconsistencies made detectives highly suspicious of Jeremiah. Section 2. Surviving a dark history. As detectives kept digging, the interviews with Jack's surviving family painted a picture of severe, just ongoing trauma. A quick heads up here, guys. Some of these details are deeply unsettling. Take a look at this quote from Jeremiah. He told police, "He beat the other kids, but he would beat the crap out of me worse. I was the oldest." This really anchors us in the severe physical abuse Jeremiah claimed to have suffered at his father's hands since he was a little kid. Jack wasn't described as a loving dad at all. He was this terrifying, erratic presence who would vanish for years, only to come back and inflict misery. So the crucial point is that this abuse wasn't just isolated to Jeremiah. The family's testimony revealed that Jack allegedly inflicted widespread, absolutely suffocating psychological terror on the entire family. Like, in one specific incident, Jack supposedly got super violently paranoid. He claimed a Christian group had paid his daughter to wear a wire, and he subsequently threatened to murder almost every single member of his immediate family. Literally, they were living in a state of constant fear. But the allegations, they didn't stop at standard domestic violence. The family hit investigators with these wild, highly sensational claims. Jeremiah actually claimed his father had cannibalized 13 Mexican immigrants and that Jack forced him to help process the meat since he was 6 years old. No way, right? They also alleged Jack's father ran a satanic cult in the 80s, detailed Jack's severe paranoia about government tracking, and most devastatingly, Jeremiah alleged that Jack sexually assaulted him the very night he vanished. Now, we have to carefully note here, these were the family's subjective, highly traumatized accounts. And suddenly, detectives have the nearly impossible task of figuring out what's actually true. Section 3. Testimony versus physical evidence. Now, what's really interesting about this phase of the investigation is seeing how police have to untangle extreme emotional claims from cold, hard reality. The family vehemently claimed Jack had murdered his ex-girlfriend, Joey, and her son, and that he literally kept victims' bodies in freezers. Well, police actually tracked Joey down, and she was found completely alive and well over in Penrose, Colorado. Plus, absolutely zero evidence of those 13 cannibalized victims was ever found. So this proved to detectives that, while the family's terror was 100% real, their narrative of events was heavily distorted. Armed with that knowledge, detectives zero back in on Jeremiah. And under intense questioning, Jeremiah finally snaps. He confesses to shooting his father in the back of the head and dismembering him. Section 4. Mapping forensic discoveries. All right, so following that shocking confession, investigators basically had to map out exactly where the physical evidence was hidden across Colorado. First up, Jack's trailer in the Orchard. They didn't find human remains there, but they did find demonic altars, rotting animal skulls, and scattered bones, really pointing to this bizarre occult fascination. Next, they searched the Dog Hotel, which is a residence where Jeremiah lived. There they find a weird jar of dark liquid, Jeremiah's personal journals, and concrete buckets. Finally, Jeremiah claimed he tossed the murder weapons into the Animus River, but because of the fierce current, nothing was ever recovered from the water. We definitely need to talk about those journals found at the Dog Hotel. Inside, police discovered this incredibly unsettling sketch of a dismembered body. Right next to this chilling sentence, "Kill him and I will do what is necessary for my survival." Up until this exact moment, Jeremiah had framed the killing as a totally spontaneous act of self-defense right after a sexual assault. But this journal entry, it heavily contradicted that story, pointing strongly toward premeditation. And this brilliantly illustrates how physical evidence can just completely flip a narrative. The most gruesome discovery was inside those large plastic buckets in the Dog Hotel's storage room. X-rays revealed Jack's hands, feet, and his skull, all encased in solid concrete. But here is where the forensics get tricky for Jeremiah's confession. The skull had a single bullet lodged right in the front of the forehead. Actually, think about that for a second. That directly contradicts Jeremiah's whole story about grabbing a pistol and shooting his dad in the back of the head. Which kind of forces us to stop and ask a profoundly difficult question. How in the world does the justice system weigh an extreme documented history of psychological abuse and a claim of self-defense against a gruesome, seemingly premeditated dismemberment? Jeremiah undeniably survived a horrific upbringing, but his actions, stabbing his father's severed hands over 190 times, burning the torso, and cementing the head in a bucket, that goes way, way beyond simple self-preservation. Section 5, Progression to Final Sentencing. Okay, let's look purely at how the courts actually handled this absolute labyrinth of a case. On March 29, 2008, Jeremiah is officially arrested for second-degree murder. The legal process dragged on for over a year until August 2009, when he ultimately takes a plea deal. But then, there's this tragic, sudden twist. Just a few years later, on March 2, 2012, Jeremiah passes away from unconfirmed causes. He was only 24 years old, and he had just recently been released. Just to put things into perspective right out of the gate, check out this massive number: $500,000. That was Jeremiah's initial bond when he was first locked up in the Montezuma County Jail, staring down that second-degree murder charge. The courts were taking this incredibly seriously. But, in cases heavily layered with extreme domestic abuse, things rarely stay that cut and dry. Here is the final legal resolution. Jeremiah ultimately pled guilty to 1 count of reckless manslaughter and 1 count of felony menacing. When you contrast that initial $500,000 murder bond with these final charges, it's a massive pivot. The judge sentenced him to just 3 years in jail. And since he already had 443 days credited as time served, his actual time behind bars was surprisingly brief for a homicide involving dismemberment. However, the court did mandate some serious long-term oversight. 141. That's how many months of intensive probation Jeremiah was sentenced to serve following his release. The system essentially tried to find a compromise here. They were acknowledging the mitigating factors of his father's horrific, undisputed abuse, but they still had to punish the undeniable act of taking a life and mutilating a body. Of course, as we covered, Jeremiah would tragically pass away long before finishing that probation. Which really brings us to the end of this explainer, and it leaves me with one final, incredibly tough question to ask you all. When physical evidence only tells half the story of a family's trauma, and memories are so warped by profound suffering, can the legal system ever truly deliver complete justice? Jack Barry was a man who allegedly brought terror wherever he went, and his demise was just as violent and mysterious as the life he led. Thank you so much for joining me to walk through this fascinating, if incredibly dark, investigation. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.